The Turing test is where you chat to a computer and a human, and you try and figure out which one is the computer. Now, the computer's job is to try and fool you by pretending to be a human. So it's not just got to be book smart and creative, it's also got to be a bit sneaky. For example, if you ask an arithmetic question, the computer could just answer immediately, but then you'd spot it straight away. So instead, it should pause, pretending it needs time to think, just like a human. And it also needs to throw in the occasional mistake to make it look human, like mixing up your and your. Now, the human's job in the game, the one you're chatting to, is to try and help you figure out that they're the human. But obviously they can't just write, "I'm the human, the other one's the computer," because the computer can just say the same. At least, this is what I thought the Turing test was. But then I started actually reading Turing's original paper where he describes his test. Because weirdly, Turing doesn't just talk about a computer pretending to be human, but both a man and a computer pretending to be specifically a woman. Now this is odd, because the Turing test is meant to measure whether a computer can think, which has nothing to do with gender. In fact, there's actually debate over what Turing really meant by his test. Some academics have even suggested he's talking not about a computer and a man pretending to be a woman, but a computer pretending to be a man pretending to be a woman. So what really is the Turing test? And is it a good measure of intelligence anyway? Let's take a look. When Turing wrote his now classic paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, people were saying things like, a computer could never think because it doesn't have a soul. Or, computers can't think because they're not conscious, they don't have emotions like we do. Now, Turing's idea was to simply ask, how do we tell whether other humans can think? We don't crack open their skulls and look at their brain to see whether they have a soul, consciousness, or emotions. Instead, we just talk to them. And if, by chatting to them, we see that they can solve puzzles, be creative, or learn new concepts, then the simplest explanation is that they're actually thinking. And Turing just suggested we should apply this same standard to computers. If, by talking to a computer, you see that it can solve puzzles, be creative, or learn new concepts, then the most reasonable conclusion is that it can actually think. By the way, Turing had a cheeky reply to those who insisted that you need a soul in order to think, and therefore a computer couldn't. Why couldn't God give a computer a soul if he wanted to? You wouldn't want to say that God couldn't do something, would you? Okay, so we're chatting to this computer to see if it can solve puzzles. But how hard do these puzzles need to be? And as for creativity, should we be satisfied with some crappy poetry? Or does it need to write the next War and Peace? Now, the elegance of Turing's test is that whatever standard we apply to humans, we should also apply that standard to computers. We don't say that other humans are only capable of thinking if they can write something as good as War and Peace, so why should we hold a computer to that standard? If you can't tell the difference between the computer and the human's responses, then that's good enough. So the classic setup of the Turing test is to put a computer and a human in a separate room and type messages to both of them back and forth, and try to figure out which one is which. Of course, it needs to be typed messages unless the handwriting of the human or the typewritten messages of the computer gives things away. And to fool you, the computer has to pause an appropriate amount of time before answering each question. For example, Turing suggests the conversation with the computer or the human might go something like this. Question: please write me a sonnet on the subject of the fourth bridge. Answer: count me out on this one, I never could write poetry. Question: add 34,957 to 70,764. Answer: pause for about 30 seconds, and then answer 105,621. Do you play chess? Yes. I have my king at e1 and no other pieces. You have only your king at e3 and a rook at a8. It's your move. What do you play? After a pause of 15 seconds, rook a1 mate. I think it's worth pausing for a minute here to appreciate just how forward-thinking Turing's being here. He wrote his paper in 1950 when computers were enormous, extremely slow, and had hardly any memory. The year before he wrote his paper, Cambridge had built the EDSAC. This could do over 600 operations a second, but now even a smartphone can do trillions a second. To put this in perspective, if the EDSAC had continually added numbers from the moment it turned on in May 1949 until the end of this year, 2025, that's nearly 28,000 days, then the number of additions it would complete in that amount of time, the iPhone 13 could do that same number of additions in about 1.2 seconds. Okay, so we've got this computer and a human in another room that we're chatting to. But how often does the computer have to fool us in order for us to say that it's passed the test, for us to be satisfied that it can think? If it fools you 1 time in 1,000, is that good enough? Or maybe it has to be so good at fooling you that you might as well guess by flipping a coin? This is where it helps to actually read Turing's paper. Surprisingly, he describes his test in 2 steps. First, there's what he calls the imitation game, where instead of a computer and a human, you have a man specifically and a woman. Now the man has to pretend to be a woman, and your job is to figure out which one is which. The woman just tries to help you. Then in step 2, he writes, we now ask the question, what will happen when a machine takes the part of A, the man, in this game? Will the interrogator decide wrongly as often when the game is played like this as he does when the game is played between a man and a woman? Read literally, it seems that everyone is wrong about the Turing test. Everyone thinks it's just between a computer and a human, but actually it's first between a man and a woman, and then between a computer and a woman. Now this solves the problem of what counts as a passing grade. The computer passes the test if it fools you into thinking it's a woman at least as often as the man does. But it also solves another interesting problem. If the test is just between a computer and a person, then the computer has a more difficult job, because it has to pretend to be something it's not, a human, whereas the person just has to be themselves. And this would make the game unfair on the computer. So Turing seems to have come up with a neat solution. Now, both the computer and the man have the same job. They both have to pretend to be a woman. It's a fairer test, right? This is why I thought Turing introduced gender into his test. It's not that men and women have different thinking abilities, even though some academics have accused the test of resting on sexist assumptions, but that it puts the computer and the man on even footing. They both have to pretend to be something they're not. Okay, but then if you think a bit harder, you realize that this absolutely doesn't solve the problem, because presumably it's easier for a human to pretend to be another human than it is for a computer to. So instead of a woman, maybe we need someone or something that's equally hard for both humans and computers to imitate. And obviously, it still needs to be able to think, because the whole point of the test is to see whether a computer can think. But does anything fit this description? What's not human but can still think? A dog? Well, a dog can think for sure, but not very well. Maybe if we were visited by intelligent aliens, we could ask them to play? But then both the human and the computer would probably be terrible at imitating the alien. And so what would we really learn? Okay, let's try something else. Maybe we could instead get the computer and the man to imitate each other in 2 separate rounds. So you could alternate. First, they both act as a computer, and then they both act as a man. While Turing doesn't explicitly suggest this, he does note that it would be a very unfair test for the man, because computers can do arithmetic so fast. In the be a computer round, you could easily suss out the man by simply asking them both to multiply 2 10-digit numbers, which the computer could correctly do in a flash. But hang on a minute, there's a much bigger problem here. Let's go back to the literal interpretation of the Turing test, where first the man pretends to be a woman, and then the computer pretends to be a woman. We made them both imitate women, hoping that this would make it a fairer test. But this has caused a different problem that's even worse. What do we tell the interrogator, the person chatting to them, in the second round? If we tell them the truth, that in the first round it's a man and a woman, and in the second it's a computer and a woman, then presumably they'll use different tactics in the 2 rounds. And this will make the test unfair again. Imagine for a second you're actually trying to distinguish a man and a woman over text messages. What would you ask? Here's one thing you could try. The average man probably has a worse grasp of female anatomy than the average woman.
Do most women have 1 uterus or 2?
2.
How many fallopian tubes do women have? 1.
So it seems you'd have a pretty good chance of sussing out the man simply by asking a few questions about this. Of course, this tactic works better if you yourself know the answers. But if the interrogator does this, if they use this strategy, then it completely ruins the test. Because then for the man to fool them, he only has to know about female anatomy because that's what he's getting asked about. But in the second round, the interrogator knows they're not dealing with a man, but a computer and a woman, and so they're going to change tactics and ask loads of hard questions that require intelligence. And then it's not a meaningful comparison anymore. So what's the alternative? Maybe we should lie to the interrogator and tell them that in both rounds it's a man and a woman? But this is an even worse idea, because now the interrogator is also going to ask the computer about female anatomy. Now, to be clear, a computer that could answer free-form questions about literally any specific topic was almost unimaginable in 1950, and it's possible that people back then would have thought it required thinking whatever the subject. But we have to acknowledge that something has gone badly wrong here. The test is meant to determine whether a computer can think, not whether it has deep knowledge of female anatomy. So it seems we're screwed either way. If we tell the interrogator the truth, it stops being a fair test, because they'll use different tactics for the different rounds. And if we lie, well, then they'll end up asking the computer specific questions about gender, rather than testing its general thinking abilities. Now, Turing, he was a pretty smart guy. He probably thought about this. So we should think now that maybe we've just misunderstood what he meant in his paper. So let's go back to what he wrote. We now ask the question, what will happen when a machine takes the part of A, the man, in this game? Will the interrogator decide wrongly as often when the game is played like this, as he does when the game is played between a man and a woman? These questions replace our original, can machines think? Reading closely, you see that this is actually ambiguous. He's definitely saying we should replace the man with a computer, but what is now the goal of the computer? We just assumed it stayed the same, pretend to be a woman, but he doesn't explicitly say this. Maybe he meant that the computer should just pretend to be a human, not specifically a woman. But this doesn't really solve anything, since the interrogator is still going to be asking questions about gender in the man versus woman round. We get a clue on how to interpret Turing's words later in the paper, where he writes, I believe that in about 50 years' time, which is around the year 2000, it will be possible to program computers to make them play the imitation game so well that an average interrogator will not have more than 70% chance of making the right identification after 5 minutes of questioning. So now Turing's dropped the comparison entirely. Before, he asked whether the computer can fool the interrogator more often than the man can. But now, he's simply saying that in the future, computers will be able to fool the interrogator at least 30% of the time. And this seems to be good enough for him to say that such computers will be able to think, because he then writes, I believe that at the end of the century, the use of the words and general educated opinion will have altered so much that one will be able to speak of machines thinking without expecting to be contradicted. So which is it? Are there 2 rounds in the Turing test or just 1? Is the computer meant to pretend to be a human or specifically a woman? Now, my own view is that we shouldn't get too hung up on what exactly Turing meant. What really matters is what the best test would look like. And as we've seen, when you have 2 rounds and the computer has to pretend to be specifically a woman, the test just stops making any sense. It stops being a good test of whether a computer can think. My own best guess is that Turing meant the test to be just between a computer and one human, and that the gender of this human didn't matter. I think he introduced the topic via the imitation game, with the man and the woman, just as a kind of mental warm-up for the reader. Now, this may seem sacrilegious, but I do think he kind of messed up when he said that we should ask whether the computer can fool the interrogator more often than the man can. And the rest of the paper sort of implies that he didn't really mean that anyway. And as we've seen, it creates a big mess and ruins the test. So the version of the Turing test everyone believes in, with just a computer and a human, is probably what Turing meant after all, despite the academic debate. It's not literally what he wrote, but it's almost certainly what he meant. But while this is the best version of the test, it does still have its flaws. Surely it's possible that the computer can think all right, but not in a human-like way? Or that it's super intelligent, but really bad at the specific task of pretending to be a human? Then it would be totally possible that something could fail the Turing test while still being able to think, just like a super smart alien could fail the Turing test, simply because it thinks or talks in a very different way. So the Turing test only goes one way. If a computer passes it, we should conclude that it can think. But if it fails, well, then the jury's out. So what do you think? How literally should we take Turing's words? Is his test actually good? And now that we, in fact, have computers that can pass the Turing test easily, should we conclude that they can think? Or does this just point to something weirder and a weakness of the Turing test? One of the papers that helped me get clear on the Turing test was Turing's Rules for the Imitation Game by Gualtiero Piccinini. It was after reading this paper that I understood we shouldn't take Turing's words so literally. I've linked this paper along with Turing's original in the description. They're a very fun read, so go check them out. Thanks for watching. I enjoyed making this video, and if you liked it, consider subscribing because there's plenty more to come.
How many fallopian tubes does the average lady have?
1.